Can you hear me back there?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great.
So I just want to say that the narrative of Stonewall is actually misleading because the actual first activism by the queens, the trans people, was 3 years before in San Francisco in the Tenderloin in the Crompton cafeteria. And I also want to say it's always been the queens who've led the charge. And I use the word queens because that's how we called ourselves in the 70s, queens and trannies. The word transgender came later in life as we've evolved. So the differences is there's a lot more people in the States for the radical activism than there is in Canada. In my time period in the 70s, we were very quiet activists, quiet marchers. Stonewall happened a day after Canada removed homosexuality as a criminal offense, and nobody really focuses on that. We tend to forget our own Canadian history, which I think is something that we need to start talking about. Later on in my life as a transsexual, I had my sex change in 1981. I can relate to some of the stories about hormones, what we call street hormones. For $10, we'd get a shot in the ass. We'd all celebrate walking out of the restaurant bathroom all feeling like girls because we had our shots. So we did a lot of that. And for a period of time in Montreal, Jaylene talked about that, and I talk about injecting silicone. There's a lot of my friends that did that, and they all wanted me to go, and it didn't happen. So there was a lot of underground surgery and surgical stuff. And in the States, they even had the surgeries underground, which we didn't have here. So you could actually pay and go into a locker place that you rent as a locker for furniture and stuff, and people would perform surgeries there. And a lot of our trans women died because of that. That happened in the States. I don't know of any story of locker room operations in Canada yet. It might come out eventually if that happened. But then, also in Canada, we went gently towards law. The law was important. And that's how I met Barbara Finley in the 90s. Because my friend and I had started a drop-in center, had received public funding for transsexual, transgender people that were HIV positive sex rape workers, and we got funding under the health ministry. But Deborah wanted human rights, and so what we did is she applied for a grant, and she invited the funders into this place. It was in the basement where there was a boiler room, and said, this is our drop-in center. This is what we're working out of. This is where we feed the girls. This is where we do the outreach. And the Law Foundation gave us a grant, and Health gave us a grant. And we proposed to bring trans people together. But before we did that, we actually traveled to the States and brought back the model as an umbrella term, the transgendered model as an umbrella term. Because before that, we were really living in a binary. And I was very proud to be a transsexual with my F, and I was not going to let go of that. I wanted my binary. And so we did that, and Barbara helped us bring the community together. And that, around 1994, Barbara, that was the first time that actually transsexuals in Vancouver that I knew of, and even in Canada, were organizing legally to demonstrate the legal differences of being treated as a transsexual woman or man going through health services and a cisgendered person. And there was a lot of things back then that we could prove. So that was a trampoline for me. That was the beginning of trans law stuff. And it was built upon by many different groups through the decades. But Barbara's been involved since the beginning with that. And so I think that's the difference between Canada and the US is we were able to gain rights federally and provincially. But with that, I want to say we need to be careful. By a strike of a pen, if you're laissez about your vote, you will not get the people in power that needs to protect you. And with the same stroke of a pen, those people that are in charge will remove our rights. And we have to keep at it. We have to be diligent all the time. Yeah.
Does anybody want to respond to that same question?
So, you asked about some differences in the laws and how they influence politics and the way things are going in the U.S. and here. And there are several, and I just want to touch on a few. One of the things that are very important is that school policy in the United States is very localized, and at the same time has this overreaching national department, which is like the Title IX things and so forth. But the way they operate there is the local school board has the ability to set all kinds of rules in the U.S., which has fed the transphobia profoundly. It fed the homophobia before, now we're at transphobia. In Canada, we have our human rights laws, which, you know, basically they are, well, Barbara can speak much better about the details of how that works, but basically a protection under our Human Rights Code or Human Rights Act are read into the charter. They're the highest level. The Americans don't have this. They don't have protection of gender identity or expression. They don't have protection of sexual orientation. They have a right to marry, for example. And they never passed the ERA in the US. And those laws, which come out of the charter, have a profound impact in Canada because we have explicit protections that are very, very difficult to undo. But nonetheless, as you mentioned, these laws can be undone. Just today, you know, the Conservative Party of Ontario passed a resolution to undo protections that are based on explicit protection of gender identity. So we have to be very careful because laws can actually be taken away, right? Yes. And human rights laws that are passed have to be protected.
Anybody else want to say anything? Yeah? Yeah.
So as Morgane says, in Canada we have a constitution which includes the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. You won't find gender identity and gender expression, nor will you find sexual orientation in the list of protected grounds. However, the courts have said, if you're a member of a marginalized group, you too have charter protection. And what that means is we can do, and we have done, overturning any laws which are homophobic or now transphobic. For example, Alberta specifically, legislatively, on purpose said, we're having a human rights law and we're not including sexual orientation. They did. I tell you this, it's a true thing. So a queer teacher went to the Supreme Court of Canada and that court said, you can't have a human rights code that only protects some marginalized people. So then, in addition to so that's part of the constitution of the country, and it's almost impossible to change because no single government in the country can change that law. Although individual governments can say, we don't care about the charter, we're going to use the notwithstanding clause and we're going to pass discriminatory legislation. If they do, and literally they have to say, notwithstanding the equality clause, we're going to discriminate. And they can do that, but any law that they pass is only valid for 5 years. So then they have to repass it. I'm with you folks saying, watch out. Because all that's true, what's also true is that a change in the zeitgeist can mean that there will be a transformation. But we have been really, thanks to people like everybody sitting here, plus all the other people in the, and every other activist and every other trans person who has lived their lives and been willing to do that in a way that is open so that the rest of us cis folk can learn, has been instrumental in changing most of the facially discriminatory laws. Okay? That means the ones that say on their face, trans people are not welcome. I am so angry right now because one of the things that I've done over those years is listen to all those stories and been part of the actions to make change and to stand with trans folk through absolutely appalling treatment that we cis people have been part of perpetuating through our ignorance. So I want to thank you for the honor of being with you.
Thank you, Barb.
Well, I'd like to return the sentiment, because sitting here, I feel very humbled to be sitting next to the two of you, because I came into this fairly late in the game. You know, I was 57 when I came out, transitioned a year later in 2008 at the age of 58. So I feel like I stand on the shoulders of a lot of people who went before me, and I recognize the privilege that demonstrates. And one of the things that kept me from doing anything about my struggle was I had embraced Christianity with, and held on to it really tightly, because that's how I tried to suppress and repress these very confusing feelings. And as you said, the word transgender was not really available until almost 1990. So I was almost 40 years old before I heard that term, and finally had a definition and a vocabulary and a framework that helped me make sense of everything I had been experiencing since I was a little child. But going back to when I was in my 20s, that's when I had my moment of faith during the Jesus People movement in California, and I turned to that with the hope that that's what was going to fix me, and prayed and did all the things that you're supposed to do to try to, die to yourself daily and all that kind of stuff. So my faith was important to me. It probably kept me from doing stupid things, because many times I thought about ending it, but something kept me from doing it. And so anyway, 11 years ago, I finally was able to reconcile my faith to what the doctors were telling me for the first time. And in a sense, I felt I had permission to get the help that I had discovered was available. But I was I had internalized so much transphobia and homophobia all those years that I did not have any contact with the LGBTQ community. As a matter of fact, I didn't attend my first Pride event ever until 3 years after I transitioned. That's how far back in the closet and suppressed and repressed I was. And then that's when I started hearing the stories. My first Transgender Day of Remembrance event was 2010. And I cried that night because I didn't know. I had not heard the stories. It's when I got my initiation into some of these, the legacy of what had gone before, because I was so clueless, really ignorant. So what breaks my heart today, and which is a very tactical approach that the conservative Christian right has taken in the United States, the politicians, Mike Pence, the Family Research Council, the Liberty Foundation, all those groups who have conspired to do everything possible. And the Family Research Council, like a month after Caitlyn Jenner's reveal in Vanity Fair, which happened in May of 2015, in June 2015 they published their white paper, which is literally the marching orders for everything we see happening in the United States, the tactics, and here, because evangelical, conservative, fundamentalist Christians in Canada look at that as the template for what needs to happen here. And so the anti-SOGI movement that we see happening in BC and in Alberta and in Ontario now is all from that template. And that just pisses me off. And it embarrasses me that people who claim to be Christian could be acting so un-Christ-like. And so anyway, But like I said, I thank you for all the work that you guys have done, and it's such a privilege to know you now personally and to work with you and to collaborate, and so thank you.
People have questions?
Do we have questions from the outside? Yeah.
Sorry.
Do you want some? You're good.
My name is Osmond Guerra-Mains. My pronouns is he, him, and his. I work within Qmunity, and so I wanted to say that, like, it's so powerful today in terms of like even the reading and to hear you folks say different things that's between the States and Canada, just because through even with my work, I always have to try to fight to say, hey, we live in Canada and we need to focus on the work that we have to do here. Because, as Morgane just stated, what happened in Ontario is something that we can see happen here, with the idea of the attack to Social 1, 2, 3. And the thing is that I feel that folks need to come out of their boxes and stop thinking about it's only an LGBTQ type organization that can fight this, but also the fact that we all are from the same community, I'm hoping, and if not, hoping that we are allies to the community that can actually come forward and state, hey, this is what's happening. This is what happened today in Ontario. This is definitely what's going to happen here. And I just want to say, it's like, I would love to lend and continue to advocate with you folks, especially the Morgane with J Foundation and with Lisa, and with you. I've never met you, but I think you're great, and definitely, and I would love to say that Qmunity will continue with that. And so again, folks, I just want to stress the fact that this is something that is happening in our country, Canada, the so-called country that accepts everyone, but technically it doesn't. And so I don't want to take up any more space because I'm taking space now, and so I just want to say thank you to you folks and thank you for sharing.
We, as a First Nation person, we've been working to have Two-Spirit recognized and come back as a tradition. And so in this area, the Tsleil-Waututh Nation and Squamish Nation, and I've worked with them over the last few years, we've welcomed back the Two-Spirit people in the circle, and we blanket them as a nation. And Musqueam just recently, not too long ago, one of their artists developed a Coast Salish logo for Two-Spirited people so that all nations in this area can use. And we're working on bringing their Two-Spirited back into the circle and blanket them. So nation to nations across the country, we're developing policies and inclusivity and welcoming back and recognizing that these are our traditions. So we need to work together. And so, because homosexuality and all that was erased by the laws of Canada, Christianity basically, but we always thought as a revered person, and so we're reclaiming that. And our national chief, about 4 years ago, there was they added 2 feathers to the National Eagle staff for the Two-Spirited people. So a lot of stuff is happening for us that way as well.
Oswald, I wanted to acknowledge that basically the essence of what you're saying, which is that we can't work in silos. And there are some very encouraging signs that we're not working in silos. As, you know, I put in a complaint against Bill Watcott. It's Oger v. Watcott. Watcott is, already went to the Supreme Court of Canada and lost a discrimination case, and is basically was confirmed a bigot, let's say. And now he's at it again. And the interveners in this case, so it's a test case for Bill C-16 effectively, even though it's under provincial auspice. The interveners are West Coast Leave and the BC Teachers Federation in support of my case. On the other side, you have the standard, the expected groups, the JCCF, which has Barbara Kay on their board of advisors, and then some others. The encouraging point is that feminist organizations, teaching federations, unions are on our side and understand that our problems are the problems of their members and are the problems of the problems of women there's a lot of intersection there. And this, of course, this is what the message of the Oger Foundation is that inclusion is for everybody. And I think this is a message that matters a lot. People fighting for their rights is very important, but people bringing in their friends and to get them to understand that it's their rights too, right? If you discriminate on any protected class, you discriminate on all the protected class next. You know, and as in Ontario, the question that we should be asking far more is, who are they going to go after next, right? It's easy to go after the trans people, but we know that they'll go after someone else next. And that's a very powerful question to ask.
I want to play a little bit of opposition here for us to think about. LGBTQI, non-binary and all of that, but you know there's a lot of discrimination within our own group towards each other. Yes. Trans people are the worst discriminated against by lesbians or homosexuals that identify as such, and somehow we need to stop it. We need to talk about it, we need to heal it, and we need to be open about it. A lot of trans people are rejected by both groups, but yet this is the only place we find peace, you know?
Also amongst ourselves.
Yes, there's that too. So we need to talk about that. You know, because we are doing racism with each other, and we are doing that kind of aggression.
Bigotry is bigotry.
That's right.
And being in a marginalized group, or being mistreated or discriminated against for one reason is no excuse for turning around and doing the same thing to somebody else.
Yeah, I did that, and I'm changing that, as you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, we can all do it to each other. It's a way of surviving, you know. And when I was made aware of it, I started changing.
Well, even in the some of the dialogue and the narratives that we read tonight, there's a sense that there isn't always agreement on certain things, and I think in the trans community we don't all agree on terminology, on what is an appropriate term. And I remember just 5 years ago how I was part of a conversation with some other trans folk, and we were talking about the genderqueer people that, and somebody said, well, I feel that they're a liability because when I go out with a genderqueer person who today might be non-binary, identifies non-binary, that they stand out more than we do because we try to fit into the binary somehow and blend in. And you heard that theme in the narratives tonight, right? And so I know that we do a lot of policing because we're all worried about the optics and the perceptions, and we don't want to draw negative attention to ourselves, and so we castigate. We disdain those who stand out, and that's what the gays did with the trans and the trannies back in Stonewall and all that. And that's, yes, we need to heal them because we're not a homogeneous family. I mean, no family's ever going to be homogeneous, and you can't expect uniformity and all that because diversity is a wonderful thing, and so that's what we need to respect is the diversity.
I want to say, because I just finished saying bigotry is bigotry, and that's a very judgmental thing to say. I don't know if you know it. But what I do want to say is every single one of us have to unlearn what we've been taught by the culture that we grew up in.
Wow.
And I always, as my own example, I was organizing a lesbian and gay conference in 1991, and it was mostly a bunch of white dykes who were doing the work. And, what a surprise, eh? Back in those days. Yeah. And the question came up: are we going to call it lesbian, gay, bisexual? Yeah. And at the time, we collectively decided that we weren't going to include the bisexual people. I can't exactly remember what the rationale was, but whatever. We were wrong. You know, and I was wrong, and I have had to learn and unlearn and learn and unlearn. And so we need to do two things. We need to be willing to call bigotry and call mistakes when we see it, but we need to do it in a way which respects and acknowledges that we all have it in us to change, and that shaming people is the fastest way to making them not an ally.
I'd like to add to this. So we need to forgive the shortcomings of the others. When it comes to their identities and what they think and what their hearts tell them, we have to forgive their shortcomings. But we can't be unforgiving of their actions. The actions, first of all, our laws are all about actions, right? We do not hold against somebody who they are. No matter who they are, we hold against them what they do. And I face violent, vicious, crazy, and I mean that literally, attack routinely from people who believe in their hearts of hearts that they're the saviors and they're the keepers of the truth, and that people like us are the abomination of the demon. Often they say it literally. And for example, we have organizations that refuse to support people that they don't like. And ultimately, the question of action is a very difficult one there. But when they do an action that causes an impact on another person, that's the line in the sand. And of course, when they're funded by government or public money or a charitable number, then that's really a hard line for crossing. But generally speaking, we have to allow people to be bigots in their hearts. Some of them can't help it. And the problem is, we make bigots by the time they're 12, right? After that, they need a great deal of unlearning. And we can do that with love, but it's also so much work. And they don't necessarily understand where we're coming from. However, we do need to try to change their mindsets, but we do not allow them to act in a way that is discriminatory. That is where we draw the line. In organizations that discriminate, we put a line in the sand.
I just want to say, you talk about faith, you talk about abomination. And because I was born in Quebec, back then, in my time period, the church was responsible for our identity documents. So you got a birth certificate, that was a birth and baptismal certificate. So when I had my sex change and my IDs were changed, the church refused to give me my birth certificate. So I said, it's a sex change I had, not a soul change. It baptized the soul. And then I threatened them with human rights action, and then they issued me my baptismal. It's a sex change. It's not a soul change.
That's almost along the lines of, I was with some friends and we were saying, so we're hearing more and more the argument that, well, religious freedom, right? That's being used. That in the States, that's one of the arguments that they make, is that you have to respect my religious freedom, and according to my beliefs, I can pretend you don't exist. That's not what they say, but that's basically what they're saying, right? And one day I was thinking, we should turn this around on those people. We should start the first church of LGBTQ, and everybody who is LGBTQ is automatically part of this religious organization, and we have religious rights. And just turn it on them.
And one of the most interesting human rights issues at the moment is, why do we care about gender? Why are we carrying around documents, state-certified gender documents? Isn't that weird?
They actually cause more trouble than they're worth. I mean, so the only time I've faced problems was when I gave my passport or my ID to a person who had power over me, and they didn't believe my passport. And in France, on the way home this year, I almost got intercepted by some random security guard who didn't believe it was my passport. And all of a sudden, it went from you have a passport to you stole a passport, right? And that's a serious problem. And we don't want to be there. You don't want to find yourself facing a police officer or a peace officer with a gun who thinks you're lying to them. This is, for them, that's a major red flag. We don't want gender identity or sex designation on documents that don't need it. And you don't need to know somebody's sex. What are you going to do? Are you going to strip them? It's against the law. Police aren't allowed to strip you, right? That would be like a huge offense.
Well, except that the police routinely do, especially for trans folk. And in prisons.
And it's against the law, I think, isn't it? Unless they have a specific thing in prison, but in jail they need a special order to strip search you.
Well, there's a human rights case actually that says what they're supposed to do and not do, but sadly, that's often, people who are in the situation are often in a position to being able to file human rights complaints.
Yeah. And that's the thing when we co-authored the law brief, one of the arguments that we always put forward, thanks to you, was that using the term gender identity was more inclusive than exclusive, and that's very important in any laws that you want to change or affect change, that it be inclusive and not exclusive.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Sorry, somebody says whenever you're ready. It's okay. No.
Do you want?
Sure, okay.
Go, Cal.
Sorry, I cut you off. I just, first of all, I want to say thank you for letting me be part of this tonight. It was amazing. Cameron and everybody.
Nobody let you be a part of it. We
right,
are gifted by
We're
you.
gifted, right?
Right.
So I'm going to open a can of worms.
Oh, you are.
Just because that's who I am.
Thank you.
So now I remember the support group with Sandra.
Yep.
Way back in the day, and I
1994.
I went there looking for help, and I had my tool bag, and I said, just if anybody says anything, just tell me here to do maintenance. So, because
Oh my God, that's
right?
28 years
It was a long time ago. So, and as far as the documents go, well, we were having dinner earlier, and we got into the conversation about, I remember I'm an out trans woman. I had to have what's called a carry letter, and it said that, I wasn't doing anything of what I was doing in any criminal activity by being dressed as a woman. It was archaic. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but the updated DSM still has us listed as
Gender dysphoric
as a mental illness.
No.
No.
It's changed.
It's changed. Okay, there, right. So, but doesn't it still carry some weight in that our gender reaffirming surgeries are covered via MSP if the laws are changed, that we're not, like, we're taking out of the DSM and we don't have to have gender identity letters and get F's and M's on our identity. Does that socially, where does that put us for the future in that, it's gonna, So anyway, is that clear? Is everybody
It's
sort of
clear to
understand?
So there are medical procedures that don't require an illness. It's a condition, it's a situation. For example, cleft palate, right? You were born, those of us who were born with a cleft palate were born with a situation of a cleft palate. And it's not an illness, it's just how you developed. And we have surgical intervention for that. And that is the analog of the justification behind transsexual surgeries, despite it not being caused by a mental illness.
Right.
It's not a mental illness, it's a feeling and a sentiment. And the harm reduction best outcome is to support transsexual surgeries for those of us who want it.
Mm.
And that will always be there until, of course, politics get in the way, right? Because it's all about politics. These are policy things and politics.
Okay, thanks.
But does the DSM still carry gender dysphoria?
DSM-5, the currently used
A diagnostic and
Diagnostic
statistical manual,
Sorry.
which is the list of what's crazy and what's not. Used to include homosexuality till 1973.
As a paraphilia.
Used to, no. But anyway, let's not go down that road. But used to, up until this version, included gender dysphoria as a mental illness, essentially, and no longer does. The DSM also has now the international
Standards.
standards of care for trans people also now recognize non-binary people. So they're
The big international.
ICD-10.
ICD-10.
The International Classification of
That's right.
Diseases.
So ICD-10, which is the
International Classification of
from the
Diseases.
UN. It's from the UN, right?
It's from the World Health
WTO,
Organization.
W Health Organization.
Yes.
So the World Health Organization has declassified transgenderism from an illness to something else. Now they call it a sexual
Condition.
I'm not sure how they've
It's
classified
been turned away from a
Morgane,
mental
sorry.
illness
But
to
yeah,
like
it's a physical health
to
condition.
a sexual thing now. So it's still pathologized, unfortunately, it looks like.
Yeah, they have to pathologize a little to justify it.
Because it's no fun otherwise.
We've got a question there, and we've got some other questions up there I saw. Dave, go.
I'm just wondering, with the announcement this week from Province about the coverage of bottom surgery for trans people, and I think like
14 surgeons across BC, yeah.
the lower mainland.
across the province.
Across the province.
I'm just like, I mean, I read the articles and I was thrilled and kept sharing the articles, but I'm just wondering if any of you can speak to that and whether the optics of how exciting that is are in fact
Actual.
actuals rather than optics, as is often the case.
Up until this announcement, the surgeries, when people had bottom surgeries as opposed to top, which are chest surgeries or breast augmentations, were done in British Columbia. But bottom surgeries, you either had to go to Montreal or you had to go generally to the United States.
But they were covered.
They were
Yeah,
They
they
were
have,
covered.
they have been covered under Medicare for many, many years. Like
Travel
But
was
not the
travel was
phalloplasty.
not covered.
Not the
Extended stay was not covered.
Phalloplasty
better.
wasn't covered until really recently.
Yeah.
so the move through Transcare BC to develop the capacity to have those surgeries not only in BC but in more than one place in BC is really transformative.
It's very.
And will be huge.
Alberta, of all places, had phalloplasty covered for years.
Yeah, that was a weird one.
That was a really weird one.
There's something also that I find exciting from the public policy aspect of this, is one of the justifications for bringing this to BC was cost saving, so that we used our tax dollars more effectively.
Right.
Now, of course, in the press, it's being sloppily reported, which is an unfortunate side effect of the press, because
Yeah.
they don't have expertise, and they're reporting it as in we're now funding these things.
Yeah.
It's true, there has been, I believe there's an extension in funding on some top surgical things for trans women, but fundamentally, we're just onshoring what was being offshored before. And when you think of it, you know, 100 to 200 a year in total, at $20,000 to $100,000 a head of our taxpayer money was being shipped out of the province.
Yeah.
And now it's going to stay in the province and get used on buying lattes and things like this. So it's got a 2.5 factor. It's a fantastic thing that we're doing it locally on top of the outcomes.
They used to do the surgeries in BC in the 80s, early 80s, and it got changed. They changed the Operation Act.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff.
I have a question over here. Do you need the mic?
No, it's okay. It's kind of a follow-up to this. Do you guys know, because like Dr. Brassard's been like the only person in Canada doing it for like forever, right?
No.
Well,
No.
okay, I guess he's the only person approved. So like, are there surgeons in BC who are capable, or like who are trained to do bottom surgery already? Or are they going to find people who can do it? Or are all 14 of the people going to be able to do bottom surgery?
I don't know.
Bowman can do bottom surgery, but was not allowed to do them and wasn't being paid for.
He wasn't giving operating
operating
room time.
room for bottom surgeries. But just to correct you, Bursar was trained by Menard.
Okay.
So Menard and Bursar were the ones for the last 20 years. I was operated by Dr. McRae in Stellis, and there was Dr. Subaru in Montreal, and there was Dr. Brown as well. So there's a lot of surgeons in Canada that can perform the surgeries. It's getting the operating room.
More questions. I did see hands and now they're gone. Yes, over there. Hello. Do you want the microphone?
Sure.
Sure.
Because there are people who can't hear in this room.
Absolutely.
Hi, my name is Heidi, and I just wanted, and I guess I'm a big, fat, white, cis dyke from Alberta. There's many of us. I just want to tell a joke about myself about the being in the movement for 40 years, various, movements. And I remember one time we were trying to decide at our organization in Ottawa whether we should include the bisexual word. And I went home and I'm talking to this by my girlfriend. And she looks at me suddenly like, I'm a real jerk and says, Heidi, I don't think you've been listening, but I'm bisexual. And then she went to point out that, in fact, probably 9 out of 10 of my last, girlfriends, we'll keep the number confidential, had been bisexual too. So I was a total shithead.
I now remember the rationale, which was bisexual women have heterosexual male and male privilege.
Yes, they do.
I mean, it was the most. It was the most weird.
Oh my
head thing, but we believed that the bisexual women would go to their male lovers and tell them the secret of the women's movement, and that we shouldn't do that.
Unlike our lesbian lovers who would go and tell everyone everything about it. So anyway, I was reading The Economist the other day. Yes, I read The Economist, thanks to someone. And there was 4 pages about transgender issues, and it was all about these people, we call them TERFs, trans, anti-feminist types. I don't like to call them feminists. And it was all taking their point of view and legitimizing it economically and many other ways. But it was still down to this idea that men are predators and that a man could, the article even said, like, put on a wig and knock on a door of a women's only space or a women's shelter and then continue to be a predator. Jesus. As far as I know, this has never happened, and it's just totally absurd. But they continue to say this sort of thing, and it's just so difficult and so backwards. And maybe some people have some suggestions. Can you argue with these people? It turned out my best friend of 35 years was one, and when I started seeing Morgane, had a total fit and was just unbelievable to me. So I would just like some suggestions. Can we start dialogue with these people with these point of views, or what can we do?
I filed a complaint to the human rights and sue the shit out of them. When you pay with your wallet, you remember.
That's not an uncommon thing. In the Nelson Women's Center last month, the Women's Center made a motion at their annual general meeting to change their bylaws so that they were explicitly inclusive. And there were lots and lots of anti-trans women who came, many of them from outside of Nelson, and defeated that motion. So the idea somehow that services which were designed for women should not include trans women is a really, really, it's a mindset which is born out of the same kind of fear that I talked about when I held those views about bisexual women. and that it, I think, is a fear, and it's a fear, I think also a fear that we will stop being able to recognize the damage that patriarchy does and that sexism. So by no means do we want to erase oppression. On the contrary, we want to stand together and work against oppression on the basis of sex or race or gender identity or disability, and we know the list. And so when we think about all the ways in which we are either marginalized or privileged individually, then it's not a simple thing. Like, we all carry some ways in which we're marginalized. We were all children once, and every kid lives the experience of having other people have all the power, and we're all adults. So we all have at least that much. And whatever our particular combination of privilege and oppression is, to work forward together to be able to speak to each other, recognizing the ways oppression works without perpetuating it among ourselves has got to be our goal, I think.
We have time for 2 more questions and Morgane's response to that as well.
I wanted to follow up on Barbara's excellent commentary on this with the fact that many organizations are charities, right? And under the law that allows charities to give charitable donations, there's a requirement that if there's going to be any discrimination against an explicitly protected class, it has to be explicitly authorized by Canada Revenue Agency. Any charitable organization that discriminates on the basis of a prohibited discrimination can just be told on. And that's all there is to it. And they will be investigated, and then they will lose their charity number.
And I would say back that I think it should be provincial government and federal government policy that no tax dollars ever go to an organization which has a policy or practice of discriminating against anybody. That would save us all a lot of time.
So there has been some effort to convince the British Columbian government to add into their boilerplate contracts a requirement that this happen. And to make this happen, what would be needed is to have everybody in this room write their MLA and their MP and to say no public money should go to organizations that discriminate against explicitly protected classes. If every one of us were to do that and get 5 friends to do it, our government would be much more likely to react because this is how it works. I have a little bit of experience on that.
So do I.
Write a letter.
You've got a question right
We
here.
all do.
Thank you. What about, surgery is, I'm not saying it's easy. The complication, the physical body stress, everything. And you're just proud of yourself. But what about aftercare? Aftercare. There's so many times that I couldn't pee. And I went to the emergency hospital. They hold me and they said, we find a doctor that knows about you species. And I was waiting that they find an open-minded doctor. So that's, beside the job, everything that you're never going to find the job that you really dream of. But these are the psychological everything. But just the basic healthcare. My doctor needs to write like the whole letter that maybe one specialist accept me to treat me. Thank you.
Yeah, there's not a lot of post-op care anywhere, even in Canada, there's not long-term care follow-ups, and I think that's going to change now with the surgeons and all that. But even that, we need, like, 10 years from now, post-surgical, 20 years from now, I can tell you that I have the same issue that you talked about, and almost 30-some years later, I'm now incontinent because of the same issue that you had. That stupid doctors did not know how to deal with it.
Jeez.
Right? So post-care, post-op care is very important, and follow-up care, primary, not just tertiary, but primary care is important.
There's no doubt that having the surgeons here is a huge win for recovery, for complications. Things are much better than they were, since Transcare BC has been lit up. We have automatic follow-up care throughout the province. Things are much better, but there's no doubt that there's a need for improvement. Luckily, we have an organization now that answers to us, and that is responsible for delivering the care that we need, and we're tracking the outcomes.
Good.
Sorry, just the emergency hospital. That's the time I'm talking. You have a heart condition because of the complication that was happened to you, and hormones that these are life-threatening. You can't just if someone doesn't know about you or they are not okay with you. These are they need some doctors that knows about you.
Yeah. I can tell you a horror story, even in this day and time. I went to the hospital for a dislocated finger, and the nurse says, "Oh, you're transsexual." The intern doctor has seen a lot of top surgery, but never saw bottom surgery. Would you mind?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep. St. Paul Hospital.
How many stitches did the intern need?
So we have time for one more question, and we can certainly take this out into the lobby as well. We can certainly have some drinks, some coffee, some tea, some wine. One more question from the crowd. Anybody? Yes, right over there. Do you want the microphone? Excellent. Perfect.
Thank you.
I know, I don't know what to say.
Hi, my name is Masa. I'm not Canadian, but I recently came to Canada as a refugee based on my sexual orientation.
Welcome. Welcome.
And, thank you. And I want to acknowledge the courage in the room and the privilege I feel for being in a place where such a conversation can actually happen.
Mm-hmm.
It's fascinating. And I also want to shed the light on the trans community outside of Canada. For the past few days, authorities in Turkey have been arresting trans folks off the streets, putting them in jails or deporting them back to their home countries. A few were deported back to Syria, Morocco. So I think if you could go out of your way and maybe email the Turkish embassy in Canada and ask them to give a bit of support, I think that will help some people who are really suffering. Thank you.
And ask our government to ask the Turkish government. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. And with that call to action, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Let's take it outside.